So good evening, everyone. I think you all know me. I'm Nick Tornato, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here to introduce our first ever Jan Kozma Memorial Lecture. This is a new bequest that the museum has received. Jan Kozma received her PhD in Italian literature from the University of Michigan in 1973. She originally from Wyandotte, Michigan, and then she taught Italian at the University of Kentucky and then at the University of Kansas. She established the University of Kansas Italian language program in Florence and Rome, and wrote extensively about authors that I had to read in high school, such as Alberto Moravia and Grazia Deledda. Was knighted by the Italian state, and her bequest is in support of Italian studies at Michigan, as well as Etruscan and Roman archaeology under the terms of her bequest. So this is in partnership with the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, which we gratefully acknowledged. She passed away in 2018. So we decided for our inaugural lecture to invite Brian Rose, who kindly agreed to come and talk to us. Now, to properly introduce Brian would take up the rest of the time that we have at our disposal. So I will just give you the highlights, which are, many of which would fill up, a regular person's CV. Brian got his PhD from the University of Columbia and taught at the University of Cincinnati, where I met him many years ago. And he is currently the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania in the Classical Studies Department and the Graduate Group in Art and Archaeology of the Mediterranean World. He is also the curator in charge at of the Mediterranean section at the Penn Museum, was deputy director, was a president of the Archaeological Institute of America, as well as a gold medalist from said institute, has been the president of ARIT, and has been on countless board, is a incredibly prolific scholar, both in terms of his work in the field at sites such as Troy and Gordion, as well as in his work on Roman art. His dissertation was originally on Julio-Claudian dynastic group monuments. He's written extensively on that. I just heard over lunch that his new book on the topography of Rome just went to the printer after a laborious search for image permissions, which, as we all know, in Italy has become an incredible nightmare. I'm forgetting the Max Planck Prize of the von Humboldt Foundation, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, and the Austrian Archaeological Institute. You get the drift. So we couldn't have had a better inaugural Jan Kozma lecture, and Brian is going to talk to us tonight on synthesizing religion, politics, and the Homeric tradition, the West Sanctuary of Ilion during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Nick. It's wonderful to be at Michigan, and I want to thank in particular the supporters of the Kelsey and the AIA who are in the audience this evening. I'm focusing on the publication of the West Sanctuary at Troy, which I excavated over the course of 10 years between 1992 and 2002 during this semester where I'm on sabbatical at the Institute for Advanced Study. And that will be the focus of what I talk to you about tonight during its Hellenistic and Roman phases, but I will also review some of what we did, excavated and researched at Troy during the 25 years that my colleague Manfred Korfmann and I were working there from 1988 to 2012, especially the Homeric traditions on which Greek and Roman Troy were built. Troy, as I think this erudite audience will know, is located in what is now northwestern Turkey at the mouth of a body of water called the Dardanus or Hellespont, which links the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara, then the Bosphorus at Istanbul, and ultimately the Black Sea. So during some periods of its existence, it acquired wealth because ships had to dock here waiting for better winds and better currents in the Dardanelles, which are still quite treacherous. There are people every year who try to swim the Dardanelles, 1.2 kilometers, most successfully, not all, and those who were not successful because of the winds and the currents, which are really phenomenally strong. So in this general area, it does seem certain that boats had to dock here waiting for better weather. You're seeing here an overview or an aerial view of the Mound of Troy, which was the focus of our attention during the 25 years of excavation. Troy, the archaeological site of Troy, has been associated with the Homeric tradition for a long time, from the 8th century BCE, as I'll talk to you more about today, but it's still something of which you would be aware if you visited the site today. So as you enter the site, you see the colossal wooden horse. I mean, this is obviously not the original wooden horse. There was no wooden horse at the end of the Bronze Age, but this one was built in 1975 to give visitors to the site something to do with their children who love to come up to the top of the horse and look out through the trap doors as if they were Greek soldiers during the sack of Troy. And there is still, as I think you all know, the war, the so-called Trojan War, was spurred by the world's first beauty contest, the Judgment of Paris beauty contest, on the slopes of Mount Ida. That's still reenacted every year on the first Sunday in August. Put that on your calendars. You can go to Mount Ida, where Paris had the original contest, and there will be 3 finalists for a golden apple, which is now paper mache. And the original contest, of course, was fixed. And this one is fixed too. In this case, Miss Chinakale, who is from the wealthiest city in the area, always wins. In this case, some of the archaeological staff members were on the jury, and she was asked as part of her talent question. One of them was, of the 3, one was asked, how would you bring about world peace? The other one, these are women from, the slopes of Mount Ida, which is not exactly Manhattan. So how would you bring about world peace? How would you end world hunger? And she was asked, what is your favorite color? And she said gold, because that was the color of the apple that Paris gave to Aphrodite, and she won. So these Homeric traditions are still very much a part of life in the area. I showed you this before, the aerial view of the Mound of Troy. This is how we project the southern and eastern sides of the Citadel Mound of Troy to have looked at the end of the Bronze Age in the 14th century BCE with fortification walls that were over 30 feet high, over 10 meters high. Now, what happened at the end of the Bronze Age? For a long time, we weren't really sure, but in the course of the last 30 years, we've acquired greater understanding of what happened because the tablets that are preserved at Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire, speak of Wilusa, which is the Hittite word for Ilion, the other name for Troy. And so we have a series of tablets that span a period of about 200 years, from 1400 to 1200, that review the situation at Ilion during the late Bronze Age. And so we can tell that during this period, the Hittites were continually, not continuously, but continually at war with the Mycenaeans or their vassal states. And the vassal states of the Hittites were involved in this as well, Troy or Wilusa being one of these vassal states. So you have 2 centuries of war, in a sense the first of the East-West wars, between Hittite-affiliated entities and Mycenaean or Achaean or Ahiyawan, as the Hittites would say, entities. 2 centuries of armed conflict that, of course, over the next 500 years would crystallize into a story of a single war lasting only 10 years. And we have in these texts from the Hittite kingdom some names that are familiar to you from the Homeric tradition. So that would include Atarisia or Atreus, who reportedly came from Ahiyawa or Achaea with 100 chariots and was responsible for armed conflict, a chain of armed conflict up and down the western coast of Turkey. And then Alexandru, ruler of Wilusa, Alexandru being the Hittite word for Alexandros, the other name of Paris, whom you know from the Iliad. So there was an Alexandros of Ilion, a Paris ruler of Troy in the early 13th century, around 1275 BC. So some of these Homeric characters that we hear of in the Iliad are now attested in Hittite documents, some of which have been published by Gary Beckman of the University of Michigan. And we're learning more about this tradition in the Late Bronze Age all the time. Now, after armed conflict, there was armed conflict. We have good evidence for armed conflict in the West Sanctuary itself, which I should highlight on the southwest side of the mound. That is one of the 2 sacred areas of Troy, the other being the Sanctuary of Athena Ilios, and I will treat both of those tonight. In the West Sanctuary, we have evidence for armed conflict from the first 2 decades of the 12th century, 1190, 1180, where there are piles of sling stones, blackened arrowheads, and blackened earth together with charred timbers, clearly evidence of some sort of armed conflict in the early 12th century. Now, after that, the site was not abandoned. Habitation continued. There seems to have been no period when there was a hiatus during the Iron Age. But the next major periods of construction would not occur until the 8th century BC. Probably in the late 8th century BC, we have construction in the West Sanctuary, which I'll get to in one second, and probably some sort of sacred structure in what would become the Sanctuary of Athena. I'm showing you the Hellenistic reconstruction of the Sanctuary of Athena here, and an overview of the West Sanctuary here. The West Sanctuary was a nightmare to excavate because there's habitation here for over 3,000 years, from Troy 5, about 2000 BC, until the late Byzantine period, between 1200 and 1250 CE. So trying to disentangle the strata was extraordinarily difficult, and this is a lesson for the grad students. Don't do what I did, and my colleague Manfred Korfmann. We divided the site chronologically, so I would dig down through Greek and Roman levels until I reached 1000 BC, or BCE, and then he would take over and dig down through the Bronze Age levels until he reached virgin soil. Now, this is perfectly ridiculous. You don't pass a sign saying 1000 BC. And the pottery is incredibly ambiguous during this period. You can't tell with these gray wares that we have in the Iron Age whether you're in the 10th century, the 9th century, or the 11th or 12th century in a lot of cases. So there was constant bickering as to whether we were on my side of 1000 BC or his side of 1000 BC. Nevertheless, in the end, we were able to make it work. So the West Sanctuary, which will be the primary focus of my talk tonight, as I said, we get our first buildings there in Troy 5, 2000 BC. But after the armed conflict of the early 12th century BC, the next phase of habitation we have here, or the next phase of construction, dates to the 8th century, where we have what we thought was a Heroon for the Homeric heroes, with an apsidal ash altar inside that is built here in the shadow of the ruined Late Bronze Age fortification wall. That Late Bronze Age fortification wall the reconstruction of which I just showed you would make cameo appearances throughout the rest of Troy's occupation. It would never disappear during antiquity. It would always be there as a kind of marker or reminder of the strength of the site during the Late Bronze Age period. And of course, ultimately, it would be connected to the stories of Priam and the Iliad. We don't just have this so-called geometric cult building from the 8th century. We also have these stone circles from about 700 BCE, which were intended for dining. You see some of them here. Those are built right up against the Late Bronze Age fortification wall and placed on a platform 3 meters high. We have ample evidence for fire there, as well as craters, denoi, cups, vessels for dining. So you can imagine the elite dining on this platform with the ruined Late Bronze Age Troy 6 fortification wall behind them. It must have been a stunning sight. Now, it was in the late 8th, early 7th century that the site becomes more closely associated with the Homeric tradition. So the they weren't burial mounds initially. These are ruined settlement mounds, many of which are Neolithic. So you have a Neolithic city that's in an elevated area. It's destroyed. It ends up looking like a burial mound, even though these are the ruins of actual settlements. This is a case in point. You would read it as a burial mound, but in fact, it's a Neolithic settlement from the 5th millennium BC. A late Bronze Age cemetery at Beşiktepe, which ended up looking like it was a burial mound. And these occur all over the landscape. At some point in the Archaic period, maybe late 8th, certainly by the 7th century BC, these mounds are re-identified as the burial sites of Greek and Trojan heroes from the Iliad. So you're seeing here the tumulus of Achilles right here, which I did excavate, and I'll say more about that later. The tomb of Ajax, which was reconstructed by Hadrian, tomb of Protesilaus. They're all over the area. And so the landscape was branded as a Homeric landscape in the Archaic period. Some would call it a kind of Homeric Disneyland, which would become far more grandiose and far more Homeric appearing once we get into the Hellenistic period. Now, this is where Athens founds its first overseas colony, the site of Sigeion, which has really never been satisfactorily excavated. It's only been touched. The main part of Sigeion has never been excavated. So you see it's right here, framed by all of these heroic burial mounds. And those had all been identified as Homeric burial mounds by the time Athens founds their first overseas colony at Sigeion. So it's a more august frame for the new colony couldn't have been found. And it's at some point in the Archaic period, as they're digging down and building new buildings, they find things from the Bronze Age, which is understandable. These go in the temple of Athena, and they constitute a Trojan War treasury. So pieces of armor, one of which Alexander the Great will pull and allegedly wore in battle during his battle against the Persians at Granicus in 334 BC. What exactly was in this treasury, we can't know. Probably things that were similar to what we see in the treasury of Athena at Lindos on the island of Rhodes, where we have a catalog of what was there with all of these items that were worn, allegedly worn by the Homeric heroes. You could come here and you could see them. So gradually in the course of the Archaic period, the site was becoming truly Homeric. And therefore there were visits from august people, starting, as far as we know, with Xerxes, who comes here in 480 BCE and sacrifices, according to Herodotus, 1,000 oxen to the Homeric heroes. And of course builds a bridge across the Dardanelles, 1.5 miles in length. And interestingly enough, there's a new bridge across the Dardanelles that opened in 2020, exactly 2,500 years after the first of the bridges over the Dardanelles, although that one, of course, was a pontoon bridge. no one has a spare 1,000 oxen, and so after these oxen are slaughtered to feed Xerxes' army, the site experiences a period of economic depression, as does every site in the Troad, until the end of the 5th century BC. Ultimately, in the 4th century, Alexander will come here in fighting the Persians in the first of his major battles with them at the Battle of Granicus, where I did a survey a few years ago. It's actually much more than a few years ago. It was 20 years ago. It seems like yesterday. Here is Troy. Here is the Dardanelles. And here is the area of the Battle of Granicus. It's not where the textbooks will tell you it was. We did geomorphology, core sampling, and we could determine that the area where the battle has always been placed was a marsh in the 4th century BC. But you're seeing Alexander here on his horse Bucephalus from the famous mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii. And he, too, sacrifices to the Homeric heroes, just as Xerxes had done 150 years earlier, and allegedly takes a suit of armor from the Trojan War treasury in the Temple of Athena and wears it in battle. He promises to lift the site up to a level that would be appropriate to its Homeric status, but does not do so. This process will only begin in the late 4th century BCE under Antigonus I, when Troy, or rather the sanctuary of Athena Ilios at Troy, is made the capital of a new koinon, a league of cities in the Troad. You see the names of the cities here, and I've put dots where all of the cities are located, largely around the coast, although Skepsis in the interior is included. Interestingly, Sigeion is left out of the group, and it will be out of existence in less than a century. But this koinon brings a great deal of money into Troy because the sanctuary of Athena Ilios is the capital of that koinon. So they're paying money to Ilion, and that's where the primary festivals will take place. And the primary festival was a Panathenea. There were a number of these Panathenaic festivals in Asia Minor cities, and a big one at Troy. So you can imagine in the festival, people rhapsodes standing in the agora in front of the ruined late Bronze Age fortification wall, which you see in red here, and reading from the Iliad and the Odyssey, or reading from the Iliad in the course of the Panathenaic festival. And so imagine what that would have been like. You're reading from the Iliad. People are gathered there to watch you. You're reading in front of the ruined late Bronze Age fortification wall. So that gives credibility to the Homeric credentials of the wall, and the wall gives credibility to the Homeric validity of the Iliad. It was a wonderfully mutually beneficial situation. And then in the course of that festival, you would end it at the sanctuary of Athena Ilios, which reaches monumental form in the late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, with metopes on all 4 sides of the building. So you see the full stretch of the sanctuary here. This is a legitimate reconstruction of what it probably looked like by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, and some of the metopes, the best of which Heinrich Schliemann took to Berlin in the 1870s. But the metopes that you have here were the same as those, the same topics or subjects as what you would have seen on the Parthenon in Athens. So battle with the Amazons, battle with the giants, battle with the centaurs, and the Trojan War itself, the so-called Iliupersis. It's the only temple that we get in Hellenistic and Roman times where the subjects of the Parthenon's metopes were copied for another temple. And of course, Athens is benefiting from, or trying to highlight, its importance during the Trojan War, which in the Iliad was not a very remarkable presence, by building in the late 5th century a colossal bronze horse in the sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia. You see the red mark here. This was, judging by the hoof prints, that's all we have, it was about 6 meters high, and Pausanias describes it. In the 2nd century CE, there were trapdoors out of which the Greek soldiers were looking. And it would have made the walls of the sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia sort of look like the walls of Troy. Now, in the sanctuary of Athena Ilios, there was a very interesting component of the design that, again, highlighted the Homeric credentials of the site. The well of the sanctuary was placed on the central axis of the temple, which is not a common thing to do. There was a tunnel. You couldn't access water from the well above ground. There was no way to access the water here. You had to go through a tunnel to access the water in the well. Why would you do this? There was a tradition wherein the two maidens every year from East Locris in central Greece were required to go to Troy and clean the sanctuary of Athena to atone for the sins of their ancestor Ajax, who had raped Cassandra in the sanctuary of Athena. So you all remember that climactic scene in the Greek sack of Troy in the mythological tradition where Ajax, who is from East Locris, rapes Cassandra. And so the women of the region are forced to pay for the crimes of their ancestor, the man. And in cleaning the sanctuary, the rules were that they could not be within eyesight or within the view of the sanctuary of Athena. So they deliberately put the well on the central axis and build this underground tunnel so that when the women go into the tunnel to get water from the well, one can imagine the visitors to Troy saying, why are those women not just getting the water from above ground? Why are they going into a tunnel to draw the water? And that would give the guides who were there in antiquity as they are now the opportunity to tell the story of the Locrian maidens and again highlight the Homeric ancestry or the Homeric traditions on which Greek and Roman Ilion were built. The Homeric associations of the site weren't limited to the citadel, but also encompassed the surrounding landscape. So I mentioned the tumulus of Achilles and told you I'd come back to it. This is an area to which Alexander came in 334. He raced around the tumulus of Achilles, as Caracalla will do much later, and a variety of distinguished personages will do the same thing. And it looked like a monumental tumulus at the time in which Alexander visited. Now, what was it really? We dug it. I didn't really want to dig this. These are a nightmare to dig. Some of you know that. But in this case, looters are everywhere. And the looters would dig tunnels every year into this particular tumulus. I don't know why they were fond of this one. It was the tumulus associated with Achilles, and so they may have thought that there would be a grandiose tomb chamber filled with gold and silver inside, I'm not sure. But they left a note for us once saying, if you dig a little deeper, or if you dig a little further, you'll come out the other side and see the Aegean. That's how deep we've dug. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, but that's awfully cheeky. If the looters are leaving you notes, action is called for. So we went into the tunnels with radar. We thought we had located a tomb chamber. We dug it. This was 1999, 2000, and we found no tomb chamber, no tomb, no person, nothing. It was just a cenotaph. What we found, though, was that originally it was a Neolithic settlement, 5th millennium BC. And then in the early 3rd century BC, they added to what had been a 5-meter high mound, 8 more meters, all added in the early second quarter of the 3rd century BCE to make a 13-meter high tumulus. You can see the 3rd century BCE building of the tumulus. It looks like a layer cake. And indeed, that's the way they built it. They built it to a higher level because they wanted it to look appropriate for the stature of its alleged occupant, who was Achilles. So as I say, they were sort of Homerizing the landscape. This focus on a past greater than the present, especially from the period of the Bronze Age, was not limited to Troy. You can find it all over the Mediterranean and the Aegean in the late 4th, early 3rd century BC. A tumulus at Lavinium south of Rome, which was allegedly founded by Aeneas, is monumentalized in the late 4th century BCE. Some would doubt that that was regarded as the tumulus of Aeneas, but monumentalizing a tumulus is a pretty rare thing. They do it for the tomb of Pelops at Olympia and Achilles at Troy, and that's it, other than Lavinium. So by the 3rd century, late 4th, early 3rd century, I think that this was regarded as the tumulus of Aeneas, however it had started. And at the same time, early 3rd century, they build on Samothrace, to which I'll return in a minute, a fictive late Bronze Age tomb with relieving triangle at the entrance in honor of one of the Bronze Age heroes of Samothrace. So this reformulation of the landscape and the site, the sanctuary, the citadel, to highlight the Bronze Age foundations and the heroic past of the area is not at all unusual. You find it in many areas. So the sanctuary of Athena is complete by the late 3rd, early 2nd century BC. What about the sanctuary, which I call the West Sanctuary, on the southwest side of the mound? You're seeing an overview, again, of it here. This, as I say, was not easy to dig, and it took us a while to reconstruct it. It, as I said, in the 8th century BCE, seems to have a cult building probably associated with the Homeric heroes and those stone circles for dining. There are more temples that are built, partially funded by Sigeion, Athens' colony at Sigeion. And then after Xerxes comes, we get nothing in the sanctuary until really 280 BCE. So for over 200 years, there's no construction in the sanctuary. And then we get what we call the early Hellenistic building, and there's a lot about this I don't know, but it was filled with loom weights and spindle whorls. So clearly it was associated with weaving. And the objects that we have inside it, some of them are associated with the cities of the koinon. So the double axe that we have in the iron double axe that we found in the early Hellenistic building, that's the symbol on the coinage of Tenedos. The bronze sphinx that we found in the building, that's the symbol of the site of Girgis. These are all members of the koinon. So I think the koinon is probably helping with the construction of this building, which doesn't really last very long. It's replaced in 225 by another building, which we call the Mosaic building, because there were pebble mosaics on the floor, which were heavily damaged. There was interior activity in this temple, which is very unusual in antiquity. Normally, the temple contains the cult statue, but it's not the locus of religious activity. That occurs at the altar outside the building. Here you see the mosaic. This is an edicula with a bronze statue of a god. I don't know which god, although I suspect it was Cybele, the so-called great mother goddess of Asia Minor. You know her as the Magna Mater, and I'll get to that again in a minute. We have the bronze casting pits next to this temple for the pieces of the statue, although of course no longer the statue. As I say, heavily worn pebble mosaic. And the central emblema, which would probably tell us something about the function of the building, that's the worst damaged part of the complex, which is usually what you find. But then torch bases in the interior. You find the same sort of thing in the sacred buildings of the sanctuary of the great gods at Samothrace. On the walls, painted imitation of drafted margin masonry, the same sort of thing that you find in the sacred buildings on Samothrace. The Huron at Samothrace, which is in operation at the same time as the Mosaic building, where you can see the painted plaster imitation of drafted margin masonry, the sort of thing you can see on Beaux-Arts townhouses in New York City on the Upper East Side and probably throughout the city of Ann Arbor. But it was relatively new at this point in time, the 3rd century BCE. In this building, I found a lot of plaques, all of which could be divided into two groups. One of Cybele, so Cybele with lions sleeping on her lap. usually carried the drum and was usually shown seated, at least in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. I have a lot of these. And Cybele, of course, was very strongly associated with Troy throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods. If you think of your reading of the Aeneid, Aeneas builds his ship with pines sacred to Cybele, cut from the forests of Mount Ida, where the beauty contest occurred. And the other one, the other category would be terracotta horseman plaques. This is the same sort of image that you find on coins from the koinon city of Dardanus, just to the side of Troy. And so Dardanus is the most likely identification for him, one of the great Trojan heroes. So Cybele and Dardanus are among the gods who are worshipped in this sanctuary. In the 2nd century, it expands, 2nd century BCE. We get the Mosaic building going out of business, 2 new temples are built to replace it, and 2 walled precincts, open-air walled precincts, clearly for some sort of secret rites that were in operation. You find the same sort of thing in the Sanctuary of the Great Gods on Samothrace. And you see a very sketchy reconstruction of what these 2 open-air altar precincts would have looked like in the 2 temples that looked out on them. So this, unlike the Sanctuary of Athena, this seems to be a complex that was intended for secret rites associated with Cybele and Dardanus, a Homeric hero. Was there anybody else who was worshipped here? It's likely that the Samothracian gods, I've referred to Samothrace a number of times, were also worshipped here. We have a number of inscriptions to the great gods of Samothrace. You're seeing Troy here. This is Samothrace in the North Aegean. And from the sanctuary, on clear days, you can see the island of Samothrace very clearly. Here, one of the inscriptions for the Samothracian gods that we found at Troy. One of the primary types on the coinage of Samothrace was Cybele, as you see in upper right. And there was a kind of syncretism, a linking of the cults of Cybele, Dardanus, and the Samothracian gods in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. So Cybele and Dardanus reportedly taught the mysteries of Samothrace, because that was also a religion with secret rites, to the Trojans. The mother of Dardanus taught the secret rites of Cybele to the Samothracians. And you get a number of stories that become current in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC that link all 3 of these entities together, Cybele, Dardanus, and the Samothracian gods. So I think all 3 of them were probably in operation in the sanctuary. Now, at the same time, the Samothracian gods become identified with the Penates, the household gods of Aeneas. And that brings us into Trojan ancestry, which is very much in operation in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. When did Rome first trace its descent from Troy? That's difficult to say, but it seems to have been something that developed during and immediately after the Samnite Wars in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC. And by the late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, this becomes a holy area for the Romans. And again, the Samothracian gods become associated with the Penates, the household gods of Aeneas. If you were in Rome during this period, you would begin to see signs of Trojan ancestry. So beginning with the Pyrrhic Wars, the wars between Rome and Pyrrhus of Epirus in the 270s BC, you find Pyrrhus presenting himself as a descendant of Achilles, and the Romans presented as descendants of the Trojans. And it's at that time on coinage that Roma begins to wear the Phrygian helmet. This helmet with a kind of tassel coming over the top. It ultimately develops into a symbol of liberty during the 18th century, during the French Revolution and the American Revolution. That's a mistake, but nevertheless it becomes firmly established, so that if you look at personifications of liberty on American coinage in the late 19th, early 20th century, she's wearing the Phrygian cap. And so too is Roma here, as a way of drawing attention to Rome's Trojan ancestry, which it has now recognized. Now, with the recognition of Rome's Trojan ancestry, the gods associated with Troy assume greater importance. And at the end of the 3rd century, we have the import of the goddess Cybele, the Magna Mater, to Rome near the conclusion of the Second Punic Wars with Hannibal. So 205 BCE, the cult of Cybele, or rather a black meteorite, probably a piece of a black meteorite, is taken from Pessinus, which was a second home of Cybele, to Pergamon, just south of Troy, and then to Rome, where a temple in Cybele's honor, the Magna Mater's honor, was built on the southwest corner of the Palatine Hill above the Circus Maximus. This was an area that had more legendary associations than any other part of Rome. It was at the base of this area where the cave wherein the wolf had suckled Romulus and Remus was located. Near where the Temple of Cybele was built, you allegedly had the hut of Romulus. In the same area, Hercules fought the monster Cacus. So as I say, a whole network of legendary associations. It's not surprising that this would be the place where they would put the temple. And it's not unlikely, Eric Gruen was the first, I think, to argue this, of the University of California, Berkeley, that the import of the cult of Cybele to Rome in 205 BC was done because it was a way for Rome to highlight the Trojan ancestry of the city and the people, which was gathering steam as the Roman Republic or Hellenistic period progressed. And it progressed even further, of course, once we get into the early empire, because the first dynasty of imperial Rome, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, traces its descent from Aeneas and from Venus. So Troy is the mother city, not just of Rome, but also specifically of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so not surprisingly, there were a number of statues of Augustus that were erected in Ilion throughout the Augustan period. And we were lucky enough to find one statue of Augustus still intact. I never found the body. I found a lime kiln next to this area. So the body was probably burned in the late antique, early medieval period. But this may well have been the head associated with one of the statues that was in turn associated with one of these three bases of Augustus that we found in the Agora. It's at this point that the mint of Ilion starts striking coins with Aeneas and Anchises, his father. So I'm showing you a later one here because it was the best image I had. But forget about little Ascanius, the son. Aeneas and Anchises start appearing on coins of Ilion during the Augustan period. They know a good thing when they see it, and they had been benefiting from these connections between Troy and Rome since the late 3rd century BC. The peace at the end of the First Macedonian War, or the peace following the war with Antiochus III in the early 2nd century BC. Ilion was gaining a lot of credit with Rome during this period, being exempt from taxation and expanding her territory because of her legendary status and her special association with Rome as the mother city of the Romans. They wanted to emphasize this even more prominently by calling the Roman emperors kinsmen, or sungenes. So you look at the inscriptions at Troy of Augustus, his adopted son Gaius Caesar, Agrippa, or in this case, little Nero in 51 CE, where Nero is called the kinsman of the city because everyone is descended from the Trojans of yore. Never mind that all of the residents at Troy at this point are speaking Greek and writing in Greek. Nevertheless, what they're stressing is the Trojan ancestry of themselves as well as of the early emperors. Now, we see this all over Rome as well. You think of the Areopagus, the altar of peace in the Campus Martius, with relief panels of Aeneas arriving in Italy at Lavinium, and of course the Lupercal. And you can see this in other cities in Asia Minor, the so-called Sebastion, or sanctuary of the ruler cult at Aphrodisias in southwest Turkey, built between 20 and 60, where you have both Aeneas leaving Troy. Here, Aeneas with the portrait type of Nero, Anchises on his shoulder, Ascanius with trousers to mark the fact that they're Trojans, they're from the east, and then Aphrodite hovering over the whole group. And a little further on, you have a Lupercal, Romulus and Remus being suckled by the wolf. So the same sort of thing that you would have seen in more abbreviated form on the Arapakis. And probably the same sort of thing existed at Troy as well, as I'll mention in a minute. Now, as all of this celebration of Trojan-Roman associations was going on, the sanctuary changes dramatically. It had been destroyed during the Mithridatic Wars in the early 1st century BCE. There was a renegade Roman commander named Fimbria who comes to the gates of Troy in 85 BC and asks to be admitted. They say, no, we are loyal to Sulla, and you can't come in. And he comes in anyway and burns the sanctuary. And maybe some other areas, but I can only find the destruction from 85 BC in the sanctuary area. And then for the next 170 years, the sanctuary is just a dumping ground. No one does anything there. It's only under the Flavians, under Vespasian, that it undergoes a transformation with new construction. So remember, before there had been these 2 temples and 2 walled altar precincts. One of the temples and both of the altar precincts are buried. The first temple, Temple A, is rebuilt. There's a new altar that's built with the superstructure of the old Hellenistic altar and placed on the central axis of the temple. And a grandstand is added for the viewing of some sort of performance. But there are no longer any walled precincts for the enactment of secret rites. So whatever was going on in the sanctuary now in the early empire was very different from what had happened there in the Hellenistic period, and I'm still not quite sure. It's still focused on Cybele, because I have plenty of terracottas of Cybele dating to this period in this area, but I don't have any of Dardanus or the or any sign of the Samothracian gods. So there's a change in the cult that I still don't fully understand that happens in the late 1st century CE. But regardless of this change, Troy is still very popular with the emperors as the mother city of the Romans. Hadrian comes through in 124 BCE, 124 CE, and we were lucky enough to find his statue next to that of Augustus. In this case, we had the entire statue except the legs and the feet. Those surely were burned in the lime kiln. It's not really a very good statue. The head looks a little small, but it all belongs together. This adorned the stage building of an Odeon, which you've seen in some of the earlier slides. And they wanted to honor Hadrian because of his benefactions in the area. He was responsible for the rebuilding of the tomb of Ajax, which was originally on the waters of the Dardanelles. It had apparently become decimated by years of flooding. And so Hadrian builds a new tomb of Ajax with a masonry substructure, which these tumuli never had. They're only earth. Probably authorizes it at his visit in 124, and it's probably finished a few years later. And there are benefactions throughout this area at this point. And it's at this point that more of these Homeric themes start appearing on Ilion's coins. It's surprising, really, that they didn't do it earlier, because we don't find any souvenirs at Ilion. I've always been surprised by that. If I were in charge of Ilion, I would have been making statuettes of Aeneas right and left, and everybody else, Cassandra and Achilles and Hector, and they didn't do that. Probably the coins were the only souvenirs. And the only coins that you have prior to the Hadrianic period that emphasize Troy's Homeric ancestry were those of Aeneas. But now we get more. The Aeneas coins continue now with Ascanius, and we get 5 different types of Hector throwing firebrands at the Greek ships. Ganymede, you see the Phrygian cap, being lifted up to Olympus by Zeus in the form of an eagle, and from the mint of Skepsis, which was part of the koinon, the judgment of Paris. There are a lot of these that spring up. And you'll find them appearing in Rome also during the reign of Antoninus Pius in the middle of the 2nd century CE, when Rome celebrates its 900th year anniversary. So 147 CE. Rome having been founded allegedly on April 21st, 753 BCE. And so the coins that we get from the Mint of Rome are similar to those that are being produced at Troy. Aeneas with Anchises and Ascanius, Mars and Rhea Silvia, the white sow with the 30 piglets that was a sign for Aeneas to found the city at Lavinium, a whole series of legendary types. And it's at this point that Troy redoes the theater. So you see here the citadel mound that I've been showing you with each of the phases of occupation color-coded. Here is the theater, and after excavation in the early 90s, and what was found there was a relief of the Lupercal. This isn't very well done, but the wolf with Romulus and Remus underneath. This was part of a whole series that decorated the theater. So although I can't prove it, I think it was probably a cycle, not unlike what we see in the Sebastean at Aphrodisias, that chronicled the early history of Rome and its Trojan associations. At that point, sections of the theater seating are named after Homeric heroes. So you see here one of the balustrade blocks, and you see Deipho for Deiphobus. And we have epigraphic evidence for other sections of the theater named after other Homeric heroes. So you would be sitting in the Paris section, or the Hector section, or the Deiphobus section. Literally every component of life was tied to this Homeric tradition. And it continued as more and more emperors would visit. So when Caracalla comes to visit the site in 212, he sets up a statue of Achilles, makes an offering to Achilles, races around the tumulus of Achilles as Alexander had done. And when his freedman, Festus, dies, he builds the largest tumulus in the entire Troad, the so-called Tomb of Festus, which is now known as Uvijik Tepe. This was 17 meters high and 70 meters in diameter, so it was more than twice the size of the tumulus of Achilles, which obviously served as the model. And Herodian tells us that Caracalla was famous at that point for his histrionic mourning of the death of Festus, obviously replicating Achilles' mourning for Patroclus during the Trojan War. Now, it's at this point under Caracalla that the sanctuary is abandoned, and we, again, don't know why. But it ceases to exist probably shortly after Caracalla leaves the site, so first quarter of the 3rd century CE, and then it becomes a quarry. Gradually, the buildings become of value only for the stones that they have that can be reused in housing in the residential district of the city. And in 500 CE, there would be 2 crippling earthquakes that would essentially spell the end of life here in antiquity, but not, of course, the end of the Trojan tradition. As we enter the early Middle Ages, virtually everybody traced their descent from the Trojans. So it wasn't just the Romans. It was also the Venetians and the Goths and the Franks and the Britons and the Turks. Virtually everyone was Trojan. And even in the early Byzantine period, they viewed themselves, the power in Constantinople, they viewed themselves as New Rome with Trojan origins. So even the Greeks weren't Greek. They were Trojans as of the early Middle Ages. And you see some very unusual statements that are subsequently made by people from these areas when they would later come to Troy. So during the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Pierre of Bracieux, the French crusader, comes to Troy, he says, having just sacked Constantinople, he says, I have finally gotten revenge on the Greeks who destroyed the city of my kinsmen, the Trojans, by now sacking the Greek city of Constantinople, because, of course, the Franks traced their descent from the Trojans. And then, 250 years later, Mehmet II, Mehmet the Conqueror, after having sacked the city of Constantinople in 1453, goes to Troy 9 years later and says, I have finally gotten revenge on the Greeks who destroyed the city of my kinsmen, the Trojans, by sacking the Greek city of Constantinople, which meant that the French crusaders and the Turks were kinsmen. just like the Trojans and the Julio-Claudian emperors. And many of the states were upset about all of these rival claims. There are some letters written by the Venetians to the Pope saying, do not believe the Turks. They have no Trojan origins whatsoever. We're the only ones. Just look at us. If you go through the Dardanelles today, and if you go past the largest city in the area, just to the northeast of Troy, on the Dardanelles, you see two landmarks that that stand really as bookends of the two famous East-West conflicts in this area. The first of the great East-West conflicts, and the last thus far of the great East-West conflicts. On the Çanakkale side, the Asian side, you have, does anyone recognize this horse? From where? Okay, the movie. From the 2004 Warner Brothers film, that was on the tip of your tongues, I could see it. From the 2004 Warner Brothers film starring Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom and others, that this is the horse out of which Brad Pitt climbed. And it's on long-term loan to Troy. I mean, what else are you going to do with a wooden horse? I mean, you're not going to make a sequel. Even if you did, it's passé. So they loaned it to Troy, and so it stands now as a symbol of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans at the end of the Bronze Age. And directly opposite it, you have the memorial of Gallipoli from 1915 during World War I, when the Ottoman Turks fought the French and the British and the Australians, all of whom, by the way, claim to be of Trojan origin. And you see the Turkish inscription, "Stop, traveler, dur yolcu." This, although you may not know it, this land through which you passed witnessed the end of an era, which it did in a very real sense, in that it marks the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the modern Republic of Turkey. And even today, you find the importance of the Trojan stories in unusual places. So in the last few decades, we've seen this with books like Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, Ajax in Iraq. There are a lot of these. Sometimes it's easier for us to understand modern political conflict by viewing it through the lens of ancient political conflict, especially the Trojan War, because the Iliad wasn't a book about winners and losers. The Iliad was a book about the horrors of war and how everybody loses. And that, I suppose, is why it's so timeless and so applicable to the wars in Vietnam and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And they stand, these ties across time and space really stand as a testament to the power and versatility of the Homeric foundations of Greek and Roman Ilion. And I'm not sure that we'll ever reach a point when we don't need those Homeric foundations or those Homeric traditions in some way to understand better the world in which we currently live. Thank you for listening to me tonight, and thank you for your support both of the AIA and the Kelsey Museum.
Thank you very much, Brian. Fantastic. Will you take a few
Yes,
questions?
of course. I'm happy to take questions.
We have a mic up there, so anyone would like to ask a question?
So as you're thinking of your questions, the horse was really the bane of our existence, because you know what would happen. The workmen would excuse themselves to go to the bathroom, and then they wouldn't come back. And then I'd go looking for them. Where would I find them? The stomach of the horse. They were sleeping up there, as if they were latter-day Greek soldiers. And the staff used to like to go there for parties, and they didn't want me to know that they were in the horse. Imagine that. And so they would close the trapdoors of the horse so that I wouldn't hear them. But they were all smoking cigarettes, which is, of course, exactly what you want to do in a colossal wooden horse. And so the smoke would come out the nostrils of the horse, which you would see by the light of the moon, and it just drove the guards crazy. Okay, at least one of you should have had a question by now. Yes?
I'd like to ask, in
Do you want him to go to a microphone?
Yes, if we could go, there's a microphone there. No, we're on the problem. Thank you.
I'd like to ask in your last slide.
It's not working, but that doesn't really matter.
I'd like to ask in your last slide, you had in the Dardanelles and in the Battle of Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the Franks claimed Troy. Mm-hmm. Was Gallipoli called that before the battle? I mean, is that why it was called Gallipoli?
No, Gallipoli goes back to the Greek Kallipolis, beautiful city. Gallipoli is just a bastardization or a modification of that word. But the French, by the 5th century, had acknowledged their Trojan origins, and it's worked really well for me because there's a group called the Royal Order of the Merovingians, and they give me $3,000 a year to give to my students because I dig in the city of their ancestors. And I could hardly believe it when they called me and said, "We're the Merovingians. We want to give you money because you dig in the city of our ancestors." And I said, "You're descended from Merovec, who was the child of a sea monster." I mean, if you want to be literal about the stories. And they said, yes. So the French take it, some of the French take it very seriously still. You can also ask me about, life on an excavation in Turkey in the 90s. It was, one thing that was difficult is that in the late 90s, right after we became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Turkey had applied for membership in the European Union, which is still pending, and they used the argument that Troy is in Turkey. Troy is the centerpiece of the Iliad. The Iliad lies at the foundation of the European cultural tradition, and therefore Turkey should be a member of the European Union. And so I found that Troy was pulled into a larger political discourse that I wasn't anticipating, and so there was some encouragement for us to build it up so that it looked more monumental and more Homeric, in the same way that the Greeks had done in the Archaic and Hellenistic periods. And that was a difficult process of negotiation. For those of you who are grad students, I hope I'm not saying something with which your professors will disagree. It's good to know Greek and Latin. It's good to have a mastery of stratigraphy and know all the typology of the small finds. But what's most important as you go through life is diplomacy. Nothing is more important than that because you're dealing as Mediterranean or Middle Eastern archaeologists with foreign governments, and you need to make sure that your mannerisms, your discourse, your self-presentation is as diplomatic as possible. Other questions? Nick.
So I was wondering if, maybe I'll take this mic. I was just wondering if before Rome sort of popularizes this idea of the Trojan descent and outside of the immediate surroundings of Troy, was the glorification of Trojans already, there in sort of elsewhere? I mean, in pre-Hellenistic times? I mean, do we have instances where Greeks or other groups are trying to create the spurious descent or glorification of Troy before the Romans do that?
Well, the Athenians, of course, do it. Mm-hmm. They put Sigeion in the middle of all of those rebranded, abandoned Neolithic settlements that had been newly christened as the tombs of the Greek and Trojan heroes. So that is a monumental Homeric frame, which enables them to highlight the fact that they were more important during the Trojan War than, in fact, Homer would have us believe they were. And they augment that then with the erection of that colossal bronze Trojan horse on the Athenian Acropolis. There is a site called Ainos, that puts Aeneas on coins of the 4th century BCE. He was allegedly the founder of the city. In the 3rd century BCE, during the First Punic War, Segesta in Sicily says to Rome, "Give us favorable treatment because our city was founded by Trojan refugees." So that's one of the first markers we get of the spread of the story of the Trojan ancestry of the Romans. So it is there, certainly, in the Archaic period, but the engine doesn't really get going until the 3rd century BCE.
Don? Okay, great. Thank you for sharing the stuff about Troy. There were some really beautiful finds in your excavations. If people wanted to see them, are they in the Troy area, or are they in other museums around the world?
Yeah, good question. There's a new museum. It opened just 3 years ago at Troy. It's a 4-story museum. Everything we found is there. And so everything I've shown you, you can see there, coupled with a lot of things that I haven't shown you. There is an extraordinary series of sarcophagi that we found dating to the early 5th through early 4th centuries BCE in the Granicus River Valley area that are on display there. And everything I've shown you is published. We made a lot of mistakes at Troy. We started in 1988. We were very green. I couldn't have been more callow. But the one smart thing we did was to found an annual journal called Studia Troica, which forced us to synthesize the results of our work every year. If we didn't do that, the journal went under. So we were forced to publish every year, and in the end, we published 19 volumes. So everything I've said to you tonight, at least in preliminary form, is published.
Thank you very much.
This is probably a dumb question.
No.
Are there people also living at Troy, or is it just religious space in like the Hellenistic period? And if they're living there, what are they doing? Just supporting the tourists?
Yeah,
or?
it's a good question. We don't have much of a residential area at Troy in the Hellenistic period. This was largely a sanctuary site, these 2 sanctuaries. So you have the priests associated with the sanctuary of Athena Ilios. You have personnel associated with the Koinon, the League, and you have personnel associated with the West Sanctuary. You have workers who were quarrying stone. They would quarry the bedrock at Troy itself for the construction of these new buildings. So there's a workforce, but it's not a large settlement. It wouldn't become a large settlement until the Roman Empire. And even then, probably not until the early 2nd century CE, when magnetic prospection has shown that there was a giant residential district that was built to the south of the Citadel Mount. Yes. I think I can just give you this, Elaine.
Okay, is that on? I told you before we started today that I was working on Ganymede and the Eagle once again. And so I was fascinated by the coin that you showed. Obviously, Ganymede was Trojan. But I wondered to what extent the Romans developed some stories around that. It was Hadrianic or Antonine?
The coin I showed was Hadrianic. We get coins of Ganymede on a number of Troad mints. They like to show that. And one of the ancient authors, I forget now which one, says that the tour guides at Troy were taking visitors to the place from which Ganymede had been lifted up to Mount Olympus. So that was a tourist destination, the abduction site of Ganymede. But beyond that, I'm not aware of anything special.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
I'll do it.
I also have perhaps a dumb question, and that is, you mentioned this Phrygian hat, and is that related to some Mithraic order?
Good question. Is that your full question? I don't want to cut you off. Okay, that's a great question. Yes and no is the answer. The Phrygian cap, which is, again, this cap with a tassel or a top that flips over the front. You saw it being worn by Roma on the coinage of the 3rd century BCE. The earliest appearance of that is in Phrygia, so West Central Asia Minor, not surprisingly. In the 9th century BCE, we have it at Gordian, a Phrygian warrior. Gordian in West Central Turkey near Ankara. And then it develops into a symbol of anyone of Asian status. So it's used for the Trojans, it's used for the Persians, it's used for the successors of the Persians, the Parthians. It marks you as coming from the broader, if I may, Near Eastern area. They're very careful with it initially, as they are with trousers. Often the Phrygian cap and trousers go together as markers of the East. They were careful with it because the bitterest foes of the Romans were the Parthians, who lived in modern-day Iraq and Iran. And the Parthians wore trousers and Phrygian caps, or are depicted as having worn such. And so to show the Trojans, the founders of the Roman people, wearing trousers and Phrygian caps, and to show the bitterest enemies of the Roman people wearing trousers and Phrygian caps, that's a problem. So because you have a single costume worn by the lowest and the highest in society. So the Romans never put images of Trojans and Parthians next to each other. How could they? The costume was too ambiguous. Later, the Roman soldiers who were fighting the Parthians were worshiping a god named Mithras who wore trousers and a Phrygian cap. So that, too, is rather ironic. Mithras certainly is always depicted in trousers and a Phrygian cap. Now, later, in the 18th century, when in the French Revolution they want a symbol from antiquity that will connote liberty, what they should have chosen was the conical cap called the pileus, which was a symbol of liberty. You see it on the famous coinage of marking the assassination of Caesar, a conical cap and the 2 daggers on either side that says the Ides of March. That's the cap of liberty. That's not what they chose. You know, in the French Revolution, obviously people were moving quickly. They weren't doing proper research in the library, and they got it wrong. So they chose the Phrygian cap, which had nothing to do with liberty, as the symbol of liberty. And so in all of those paintings of the French Revolution, Mariana and everybody else, they're wearing the Phrygian cap. And then during the American Revolution, they say, oh, well, let's pick up the symbol of liberty from the French. And so the American personifications, Columbia or Liberty, they start wearing the Phrygian cap too. And then it sort of goes into general use. I mean, Smurfs wear the Phrygian cap. So, excellent question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, but I have to give you the... Okay, wait, no, I'm going to pass it to you.
This idea of tourism, I think, is really interesting because, you know, when we're looking at the coinage and we're thinking about important figures of history who have visited these different tombs, we're thinking more like top-down view, but this idea of tourism and other people who would have gone to visit these places these coin on. And so I'm just kind of curious if, in terms of the physical evidence from some of these sites, if there's evidence of, you know, like tourists coming to visit, right, like the sanctuary or the coin on, aside from these stories of like Alexander the Great or emperors going to visit these key points and places?
It's a good question. We get it mostly from the literary references. You know, Caesar coming to visit Troy and the sites where he stops, and then Augustus doing the same thing, and then Germanicus doing the same thing. Germanicus writes an epigram about Hector, and that we do have. But generally, it's the literary references to the visits that we get. And sometimes in the later Middle Ages, when people were going to Troy and they describe what they saw. What they're describing is the city of Alexandria Troas, which is a Roman colony about 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers south of Troy. So they were going to the wrong Troy. I think that only happened in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But in antiquity, it's primarily the literary references.
For a really wonderful talk. I had a similar question to Erica's, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on like kind of the nature of some of these tour guides. Is this like kind of a pilgrimage kind of tourism if you're talking about the importance of these sanctuaries? Is it a little bit of a Disneyfication of, oh, wow, look at this thing? Or is it like an American going to Rome now where you're kind of going around the Forum and looking at some ruins and this sort of...
Based on the literary descriptions, I don't think it's so different then as it is now. I mean, I see the busloads of tourists come, and they say, we want to see where Achilles killed Penthesilea. I mean, they always say that to me. And, you know, then I say, okay, we don't know that there was an Achilles, and there certainly was no Penthesilea, and they won't let you go. Where did it happen? I mean, they don't hear you. And so, you know, ultimately I say, here. You know, because then they stop. And I think, these ancient references comment on, you know, so-and-so was taken to the place where Hesione was chained to the rocks and Heracles rescued her, or where Ganymede was abducted by Zeus, or where Aphrodite and Anchises made love. That was another tourist spot. Or Mount Ida, where the Judgment of Paris beauty contest occurred, you know, once in future, and still occurs. That still happens, and I think it was probably very similar in antiquity. There's one great bowl. Cornelius Vermeulen published it. I think it was in the Festschrift for Blumentrill. And it's a bowl with the coins of Ilion soldered onto the bowl. And it's clearly a wonderful souvenir of someone's visit to Troy. Now, unfortunately, it has no context. It was bought on the art market. But it probably is genuine, and it's not unlikely that there were more such things that were passed around in antiquity.
How have you identified these tumuli with the heroes? Do you have dedications that are, say, to Achilles that show hero worship and identify the tumulus as the tumulus of Achilles?
No, this too is from literary references. We don't have any inscriptions on the tumuli. I mean, Ajax is clear. Nobody describes that in detail, but that's the only one that has a masonry substructure with, that could only have happened in the early empire. And so those are our grounds for connecting it to Hadrian. With Achilles, we have a lot of references to that in antiquity. And because of the descriptions of the landscape, we can locate them in space. But in a lot of cases, I mean, there's a tomb of Hecuba. Where is that? We don't know. There are plenty of other tumuli associated with Homeric characters, and we don't know with which mounds to associate them. With Ubachik Tepe, I mean, that's filled with 3rd century CE Roman pottery, and that's also the largest of the tumuli in the Troad, and, you know, it fits with the megalomania of Caracalla. So, you know, there we think we're on safe ground. But in a lot of cases, we can't tell.
Very much for that. I also want to ask about the tourism, if you don't mind going on a bit more about that. Do we have any evidence of authors like Virgil or Tryphiodorus going to Troy for research purposes when they describe Troy in their works? Because I think the story we have is that Virgil was traveling through Greece when he fell sick and died on the way back. So we know he was going to places to help compose his poetry. Yeah. Do any surviving accounts at all match like anachronistic descriptions of Troy?
Only in a few cases. There's no evidence, obviously, that Virgil went to Troy, or that most Roman writers who describe the monuments of Troy went there. But in Strabo, in his chapters on the Troad, you do have references to historians who went to Troy and looked around and doubted that this was the site where the Trojan War had actually occurred. And Strabo even says, you know, I went there and the houses didn't have roofs. Now, I've excavated those houses. They had perfectly good roofs. With the tiles published by Andrea Berlin from PhD, University of Michigan. But it's really only from Strabo where you get a number of references to historians going to Troy to look around and see whether or not these stories of pomp and circumstance had any merit. And many of them, according to Strabo, came to the conclusion that the people of Ilion were lying about the Trojan ancestry to get money. And why not? I mean, if you can make it pay. Yeah, that's a good question. But if you look at Walter Leaf's Strabo on the Troad, 1913, that will go through the whole situation.
Perhaps we should let Brian off the hook. It was a wonderful talk that took us, through millennia and all sorts of different kinds of classes of material. I think it was the perfect inaugural Jan Cosmo lecture. So please join me in thanking him again.
Thank you.